So now we're going to start on a little bit of a contentious topic, and that is frequency separation. And if you've been following me for a while, you probably know I'm not the biggest fan of frequency separation. And that's not so much because I think the technique is bad, but I think it's more of an issue that it's often overused and abused. So in moderation, it is a really helpful thing to have within your retouching arsenal, but people tend to just rely on it as the be-all and end-all solution, when a lot of things that they're using it for can be fixed with healing and dodging and burning. So in my opinion, it's good for you to know about it, but it's also good for you to avoid it whenever possible. And I'll explain as we go through this why I think that is. So in this image, we're going to continue on with what we have here. I've turned off the healing layer, but let's go ahead and take a little look at two variations of frequency separation. So you can either do this using, you can really use any sort of blurring technique to do this. We're going to do it using Gaussian blur, and then we're going to do it using the median blur, and you'll kind of see the difference, and we can talk about which one I recommend. So what we're really doing with frequency separation ultimately is we're trying to break down our image into two pieces of information, a high frequency and a low frequency. So with low frequency, we have this sort of general information like light and shadow and color, and just kind of the majority of what is in this image. It's just kind of what represents this. You can imagine if you really, really squint your eyes, you're kind of left with this, you lose the detail in the image and you just see those highlights and shadows. That's really kind of what you have with the low frequency layer. The high frequency is all the finer points, like, little bits of texture and things of that nature. So that's what we're doing, is we're trying to separate those out sort of in an effort to help us fix whatever problem we may be running into. So let's go ahead and actually start that up. So we're going to do the two sets as I mentioned. So we're going to do this via the median filter. And what happens via median is you can see that with median, it attempts to blur sort of inner portions that are not areas of high contrast. So where you see a transition over here, where we go between the skin and the hair, even if we crank this up to something like 28, 29, you can see that it creates just sort of a smooth line within there, but it doesn't blur the two together. So that is where the median comes in, whereas Gaussian blur will kind of just blur both of those. And the only difference between it really is that whatever the blurring technique does, the high frequency layer has to compensate for. So in this case, because we blur this line, the high frequency layer has to kind of create this offsetting effect to counter that. And I'll show you what I mean by that in 1 second. So let's go ahead and actually create this blurring layer. Now, before we do that, we need to decide on the radius, because the radius is very important. In this case, if we start off with a very low radius, all we're doing is we're just kind of blurring it a little bit and leaving, very small amounts of information within the high frequency layer, and most of it ends up in the low frequency layer. So what we're doing right now is when you blur it, you're effectively getting a preview of what's going to be in the low frequency layer. The high frequency, you kind of just have to imagine it's going to be the net of what's shown here and your final image. So it's sort of an inverse of that in order to bring back the sharp detail that you see within your background layer. So you kind of have to take it with a grain of salt. And the way I always do it as I try and find this radius is to say, okay, what am I trying to tackle? What is my problem? If my problem is, texture within here, then I may just continue to blur until I can't see that texture anymore. And then I know that that information is now going to find itself in the high frequency layer, and I can just deal with it there. So that's really what you need to determine, is just, what is the problem we're trying to solve? And generally, whatever that area is, I try and blur up until that point when all of that information is either in the low frequency or all in the high frequency. Certainly anything in between you can use to fix as well. You just have to fix them in both layers. And if you make the radius too small, then it sort of defeats the purpose of using frequency separation in the first place, because then, if you're barely blurring it, you may as well just do it using something like a healing brush or some other technique. So that's generally the guideline I have. Now, if you're using median, you're going to find that your radius generally is going to be a lot larger than it would be if you were using the Gaussian blur. And we'll compare that in 1 second. So I'm going to pick somewhere around 27, just because I know that most of kind of these textural issues will now find themselves in the high frequency layer. So we'll click OK there, and it's going to create a stack for us of all this frequency separation information. Now, if we toggle this on and off, we can see that there's absolutely no difference. We have a bunch of layers in here, but they all kind of combine together to create the final image. So if I were to turn this off, we can see what we had in our preview when we were choosing our radius. Now, if I enable high frequency, you'll see that we get the final image. And if I disable everything, you can see the information in the high frequency layer. So that's that. This one here really is just a copy of the high frequency layer, and it is clipped to the high frequency layer. And the reason that we do that is so that we can actually retouch on this copied layer and always have a backup. So if we decide that we screw something up, we can actually just duplicate it again and attach it. So, and there's actually another reason for it as well. The reason we do this too is the original layer that's on the bottom here has to be in linear light blending mode. And then anything that is clipped to here can be in normal blending mode. And if you try and attach like grafts of skin areas, which we're going to cover, you have to kind of attach it in the same manner. So this really just serves as a guide for you so that you don't have to remember all of those different blending modes and how things go. So always good to have a backup. Don't ever actually operate on this high frequency layer because we want that to be our original backup of the high frequency. If we ever need to, if anything goes wrong, we can always fall back on this layer here. So now let's go ahead and just turn this off. I'm going to turn, actually I'll leave low frequency off for a second and go ahead and turn on the background layer, and we're going to apply the old-fashioned method of frequency separation, which uses the Gaussian blur. As you can see with Gaussian blur, the radius is quite different. I think we were using somewhere around 28 for the median version. You have a much lower number for the Gaussian blur version to achieve sort of the same level of blurring, so don't expect those numbers to be the same, and in fact we don't really have to worry about the numbers because we're going to be focused on the median blurring version anyways. This is really just purely for demonstration so I can show you the sort of main differences between the two. Let's start off with the low frequency layer. So if we turn off everything here with the exception of the low frequency layer, we can see that as advertised we've blurred that low frequency so that everything is sort of, washed out and we don't have the high frequency detail in that low layer. But where I really want you to draw your focus is on areas of transition like this. So where we go between the skin and the dark hair or around the makeup here, we can see that those areas are very soft. If, however, we go into here and we look at the low frequency layer, it is not soft at all in these areas and just soft kind of on the interior, which is really what we want because generally speaking, we don't want to manipulate these, frequency changes over here. Our focus is probably going to be somewhere on the interior of the face, generally transitions that are not high contrast. That's kind of what we want to polish. And if we look at the high frequency information, so if I turn this off and just turn on the high frequency layer, we can see that in the median version, we don't have any sort of high frequency information in these areas where we saw those strong contrast transitions. Whereas if we go into this layer here and just turn that off, we can see that over here, the high frequency layer had to compensate a great deal for the fact that that area of high contrast got blurred out. So it has to create this sort of, almost halo-like high frequency bit of information to offset what was blurred in the low frequency layer. And we really don't want that because it can lead to halos in our final image if we start to sort of manipulate these areas. And so if we can just avoid that, all the better, and really, just kind of focus on the areas we need, which is areas of the skin. So that is why, generally speaking, we stick to the median area, unless you have a very specific reason for needing to manipulate this sort of high frequency information, and I don't really see a very valid reason for it. The only time I could maybe see that is if you're retouching areas of hair here and there's a lot of contrast, and you want to just kind of take entire clusters of hair and replace them, similar to the way that we did in the hair retouching course. If that's the case, you may want to apply the old-fashioned method, but generally speaking, I don't think that it's something that you need. So let's go ahead and just kind of remove that. And we're going to enable all of our necessary layers over here. And let's kind of take a look at a couple of examples of, how we can use these different layers and, the high and low frequency to manipulate various issues within the skin.